You talk about experiments.
It's existed for thousands of years, and it works in every domain.
It is about human psychology.
We take a bunch of shortcuts.
It's not rational.
Human thinking is not necessarily rational.
You're taking away something that you gave to me. Is that what you're saying?
It's often a negative experience.
There's a vast difference in our cultures.
If you're in alignment, fantastic. If you're not, great. You get to design more experiments and keep going.
I'm Shona Grundy, founder and host of These Three Things, a podcast aimed at building a thriving and more inclusive startup ecosystem through sharing real lessons from people doing the hard work. We focus on the three strategically critical aspects of the startup journey: raising capital, finding product market fit, and expanding offshore. If you find this useful, please subscribe and recommend the podcast to at least 3 other people. We appreciate you lending us your ears and joining us for this episode. Today, we have an extraordinary guest with Mike Ambinder. With an impressive tenure of over 15 years at Valve Corporation, one of the gaming industry titans, Mike's journey is nothing short of remarkable. With a background in psychology, his mission was clear: to bridge the gap between human behavior and the ever-evolving game universe. In an industry as fiercely competitive as gaming, where companies rise and fall with each game release, Mike's mandate was crystal clear: to bring the knowledge and methodologies of psychology to the forefront of game design, aiming to not just understand but deeply engage with customers. Today, I extended an invitation to Mike because his insights into human psychology extend far beyond the boundaries of gaming. As product creators for business applications, we've come to appreciate that human decision-making and emotional attachments to products reach depths far deeper than mere transactions. These insights are invaluable across a diverse set of industries, not just gaming, and should be valuable to you too, if you're in the business of building a company around highly desirable products. Mike, welcome to These Three Things.
Thank you very much, Shona. It's a pleasure to be here, and that was a very kind and generous introduction.
I've seen your career across many platforms. You've got a really interesting take about how to build deep, meaningful connections between products and games and the end users. So I'm super excited to have you here. I know you're based in Seattle, is that correct?
I live in Redmond, which is right across the lake from downtown Seattle, yeah.
You know, Seattle is pretty well known for its tech companies. I'm very aware that there's some big giants up there. So is there any that you particularly know about that you could share with us who are up there?
Sure, yeah. So actually where I live, Redmond, is where Microsoft is. Amazon is headquartered here. Boeing is headquartered here. And then most of the big tech companies do have offices up here, Google, Meta. I think in terms of like tech company presence, I think Seattle is maybe second behind the Bay Area.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on up there. Can you explain a little bit about your background for us? Where you came from, what you studied, and how you actually got into this field?
Sure. So undergrad, I went to Yale, got a degree in computer science and psychology. I love school, so I didn't give much thought to entering the workforce, so I decided to keep going. Went to grad school at the University of Illinois and studied visual cognition, so how people process visual information. And then when I was finishing up grad school, I had to sit down and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I loved academia, but I didn't think I wanted to stay there. So I started looking at tech companies, consulting companies. I had a job offer from the CIA that I almost took. But when I sat down and thought about it, I've been a lifelong gamer. I was like, hey, man, it'd be amazing if I could take knowledge from psychology and apply it to game design. I didn't know of anyone else who was doing it. I thought there was a need for it. I thought I could be good at it. I thought it'd be fun. So I was like, let me see if I can, act as a consultant to game companies, kind of trying to make this work. And so I ended up speaking to some folks from Valve at a gaming conference. They invited me back to their offices to consult for a day. So I put together a presentation on like 9 ways psychology could be applied to game design, knowing nothing about the actual craft of game design, just taking my best guess at get the presentation a few times, and then the day they offered me a job. So I was very lucky they were open-minded to the idea of hiring a psychologist.
That's a brilliant journey, actually, because as you're saying this, I was thinking, well, you're right. Like, I would say that the craft of product within technology is maybe only 10 or 15 years old. I don't even recall a title called a Chief Product Officer 15 years ago, so it's quite new. So for you to have started at Valve at least 15 years ago, this was a new concept. And I do have this feeling and understanding that the gaming industry is kind of slightly ahead of general technology. You know, they really invest in how their users engage with their platform, because they'll live and die by that, right? Like it is about their engagement. I mean, it sounds like then you've kind of pioneered this concept of psychology within games. And certainly I've played your videos to my product managers and the technology companies I've worked with. Before we dive into the subject of product market fit, what can you tell me about what you've learned about yourself and your craft whilst working within the psychology of game?
Sure. So I think ironically, right, for I guess the study of human behavior, I think psychology does a pretty poor job of marking its utility in a variety of domains. I think that's changing now. And there's been, I guess psychology has been involved in marketing for a bit. But in terms of saying, okay, we have, this discipline that studies human behavior, trying to understand how and why people do what they do. Every industry, games industry included, right, that deals with humans, right, could benefit from having folks who have studied, why people are doing what they're doing, right, and trying to help us make better decisions. And so, this can, work in terms of like, the constraints of a product, estimating audiences and kind of market fit, but really just understanding, how do people interact with a product, right? What are their expectations? What are their goals? What are their constraints? What are their needs? And then trying to figure out, and I guess devising ways to experiment and gather data and formulate hypotheses about how people might use the product and how they can more effectively or more efficiently use their product. And so, just the science of human behavior is psychology. And then you can take all those findings from psychology and use them in an applied context in any industry, the games industry included, obviously. And so it was, back then, there definitely were some, Microsoft had a few folks kind of doing this, but really the notion of trying to take findings from, basic research and apply them in an applied domain, at least in the games industry, it wasn't very prevalent. And, now there are thousands of folks with backgrounds doing that. So it's been, amazing to see the growth of at least, user research or applied psychology in gaming, but there's still obviously room for improvement, right? Both in terms of, I guess the applicability and rigor of the research, and then also in kind of the, maturity of the field. And so, lots of hard problems remain, but it's been awesome to see that, my lifelong, I guess, like academic pursuit of psychology was able to be kind of, married with my lifelong hobby and, of playing games. And then you have to turn that into something that ends up being a career. So I very much enjoyed the journey so far.
That's awesome. I mean, do what you love, right? That's always the mantra. You talk about experiments, and that's a great word, because I think most of us have come to realize, and we've been told all the time, just get that product out there and then start iterating and experimenting. And I think that's a key word and understanding. Can you explain to me some of the types of methodologies that you would employ to do experiments, and some that have worked and some haven't, and,
At the highest possible level, our goal is to acquire information that will help inform, future decision-making, right? I mean, within reason, I guess. And so what we're after, right, is just, information that will, kind of aid that process. And so experiments are simply a means of saying, okay, what kind of scenario, what kind of construct would help us gather data to answer a particular question? And so, you alluded to putting the product in the hands of users, right, and gathering data. And so, you can do, so you can do experiments after you release a product. That's maybe not as useful, and unfortunately, right, is doing kind of experiments. We call it playtesting in the games industry while your product is in development, right? And so the reason for this is that, as good as you may be at devising a very useful product, and I'll speak from the context of games, because I guess that's my background. Valve has some of the greatest, game designers in the world. Every game design is simply a hypothesis, right? It's something we think, players will enjoy doing. But we don't know if that's the case until we actually run an experiment, until we gather data from people who are not us. And that can iterate and inform our development and the idea and help us evaluate it, and off we go. This applies in any domain, right? As good as you are at design, you don't actually know if it works until people who are not you, who are not kind of encumbered by, all of the institutional knowledge that you have in creating, whatever product it is you're making. What you need to do is gather data from people who are not you. and figure out if your hypothesis, the idea you have about your design that you've implemented in some fashion, is actually correct, and is actually going to end up being something useful for users. And so, in games, the experiments we run are called playtests. We put the game in front of people who are not us, watch them play it, gather data. We can do surveys and Q&As and other methodologies, but really what we're after is just information to guide decision making, and information from people who are not making the product, but from people who are using the product. And then I think maybe the second part, well, maybe the main thrust of your question was, what are the methodologies we use? In gaming, it's playtest, right? In other product design, it's having people use your product, right? But you can ask people questions, you can give them surveys. If you're evaluating software or an app, you can use eye tracking. There are physiological based measurements like heart rate and arousal and various things that could be interesting as well. And so there are also a variety of methodologies you can use at different stages of the product lifecycle, like in the idea phase. There are concept maps and kind of user journeys that may end up being useful. But really, the most important thing is to have people directly experience your product, or some version of it, right? It doesn't need to be, it can be a prototype, often is, and gather feedback from them. Like, observe how they're using it, ask them questions about it, see how their feelings change over time, and see if what they think and believe about the product is in alignment with what you think and believe about the product. If you're in alignment, fantastic. If you're not, great. You get to design more experiments and keep going, right? And so I guess the way I think about it is that it's just, for games anyway, it's applying the scientific method to game design, right? It's the best way we have, best way we know of to create knowledge in the world. It's existed for thousands of years, and it works in every domain. I guess I'm often reluctant to speak in generalities, but it really does. And so, apply the scientific method to your product design, right? We do it with games, we can iterate, and some products are harder to iterate on, but you can still do that. You can still run your experiments, gather data from users, and then iterate and inform kind of future versions of the product. And so, that's what I spent a bunch of my time on at Valve making games. And again, it's applicable kind of everywhere. And so, you can apply this process of saying, hey, what do we think? What is the hypothesis we have about our users? Let's go figure out and see if that's true.
I completely agree with you. So your comment about, I believe this can be applied across many domains. I think, like I said, the gaming industry is actually more advanced, and we have a lot to learn from them in terms of general business technologies. Having come from that myself and then moving more into technology such as biotech and agri-tech, I can tell you that I've deployed these methodologies across these different industries. And I think what you're saying here is that really your domain is business to mass consumer. You have a mastery of how do we get our product to the masses. So anyone who's listening to this, who's doing a B2C product, should really be engaging. But I also believe that anything to do with business to business is really important. I remember hearing you once talk about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it really brought home to me some of the things that I feel deeply inside about how I live my life. But then I realized these things are important to apply to the way we develop our products for our end users, like that concept of community and belonging and autonomy. Would you be able to talk to us about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how you may have deployed that concept and actually what it is?
So I can, although I might twist my response a little bit and focus a little bit more on intrinsic motivation, which I think you may have been kind of pointing me towards. Maslow's hierarchy is kind of, it's a theory about, the basic needs that human needs to kind of feel essentially safe and kind of comfortable. And you start from kind of like the low level, food, water, shelter, clothing, disease treatment, prevention. And, you can build up into kind of, not less important, but kind of just, differently structured frameworks like social connections, right? And, having a purpose in life. And so I kind of want to focus more on like that, once the basic needs have been met, kind of what are the, when we have voluntary participation in behavior, when we can make a choice for what we do, which is, kind of when you're making a game, right? Like, there are thousands or tens of thousands of games out there. People have to make a choice to play your game. And so understanding what drives them to make those choices, and conversely, what drives people to kind of use any product, right? I think it's like just a fascinating topic to explore. And so there are a variety of theories of intrinsic motivation, but, so intrinsic here just means internally driven. I could pay you to use a product, right? And that would be extrinsically, so externally driven. And that's fine. But, what we're after, right, is building products where people are, have that internal desire to use them, right? And intrinsically motivated activities tend to, last longer, result in more engagement, more user happiness, a whole bunch of benefits that you get if people are using the product because they're some internal or intrinsic desire to do so. And so, how do we build up or foster intrinsic motivation? Well, again, that there are a few different theories, but one that has gotten a bunch of traction and seems to do well is what's known as self-determination theory. And there are 3 components there. You kind of allude to them, and I'll say them briefly and then kind of dig deeper into them. But it's kind of having agency or autonomy in your environment, showing progression on some axis of skill development, and then having some sort of social connection to other folks. Humans, and I'll make a generalization here, do not respond well to arbitrary constraint. What does arbitrary mean here? I guess in the sense of not understanding the rules of their environment, or not understanding why certain choices were made or certain choices were inflicted upon them. And so when you give people agency or autonomy, and games are a great example of this, the ability to impact their environment in some meaningful way, to make meaningful choices that have an impact, that is intrinsically motivating. If you think about any hobby that you participate in, if you like to garden, if you like to read, if you like to sing, you're making a voluntary choice to spend your time doing that. You have agency. And so it is just kind of a fundamental component to any activity that you desire to perform that is not, for some form of, remuneration, where you're not getting paid to do it. It's, I guess, a quick example here. If you like to knit and you ask somebody to, say, hey, your friend likes to knit, and hey, can you make me a pair of socks, and I'll pay you $30, to make me a pair of socks. Or you could say, hey, can you make me a pair of socks because you like to knit? And they say, I'd love to. And they do. People are kind of much more, much happier and much higher levels of social satisfaction if they are not paid to perform a task. Giving people the ability to kind of make choices, when using your product, within your product, will help foster that sense of intrinsic motivation. They don't need to be complicated things. In games, it could be a dialogue choice that has some small impact in a game, but things like that do add up. And so, we could talk about particular examples, but it's more just a broader concept of saying, okay, I have some ability to impact my environment, and if I can, I have agency and some autonomy there. And so that will foster intrinsic motivation. The second would be showing progression on some axis. And so, time is a very valuable resource. When you spend your time, you do want to see, oftentimes you do want to see, some signal that it was, the time invested was worth whatever output you achieved. And so people often look to see progression along some axis of skill, right? If I garden, I want to have, a beautiful looking garden. If I like to sing, I'd like to get better at singing. If I like to draw, I'd like to, get better at drawing. If I like to play games, I'd like to get better at playing games. And so if I play sports, I'd like to get better at playing sports. And so if you can give your users, right, some axis of skill progression, some way of showing, hey, they are making progress, right? And it doesn't need, skill progression is a very broad term here. It's more just saying, hey, using our product, will result in you improving your performance on some axis, whatever it ends up being. That is just kind of endemic to a lot of human behavior and why we are drawn to perform certain activities. The other kind of, half of this is that you do need feedback on your performance. Again, games are a great kind of environment for this, where you can perform a task and very immediately and quickly get feedback. Lots of other processes, lots of other products have maybe more delayed, if it's like, hey, we're going to, make your life more efficient in this way, and you can't see the benefits for, a week or a month, that's trickier, right? And so you are kind of, you can still build like that foundation, but it is kind of tougher to kind of build up intrinsic motivation if feedback is not immediate and direct, right? When it's indirect and delayed, that can make things trickier. So just thinking about, okay, what problem are we trying to solve for our users, right? And are we helping them solve it quicker? Hey, this task that used to take you 5 minutes, our app helps you do it in 3. That's really easy, like feedback to see, and that can help, again, drive and spur intrinsic motivation.
I just want to pause here for a minute to tell you about our sponsor, Callaghan Innovation, Aotearoa New Zealand's innovation agency. This agency empowers innovators, helping you transform your world-bettering ideas into commercially successful ventures. What you may or may not know is that Callaghan have a fantastic suite of products called Upskill. These products will help you identify the innovation, R&D, and commercialization skills you need to amplify and elevate your ideas, and then train you to put them into practice. So go check it out by heading over to their website, callahaninnovation.govt.nz/upskill.
Moving on to the third variable, humans are social animals, most of us anyway. And a large percentage of, kind of why we do what we do is driven by the desire to make a positive social comparison, right? To look good to other people, right? Not in a negative sense, just in terms of like, hey, like we do things. And so it's great when people notice things we've done, that they give us credit for that. And so if your product is something that kind of fosters some sort of social connection in some way, hey, we both have this shared experience we can talk about, encouraging and incentivizing that, for sure, again, will kind of spur and build up intrinsic motivation. And so, maybe we have specific examples, we can walk through them, and I'm not sure how broadly applicable or kind of useful these principles will be for every domain, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about, okay, how do we foster intrinsic over extrinsic motivation? Because we do want people to engage long-term with our products. If you can give them agency or autonomy in some fashion, if you can help them see progression on some axis, and if you can give them a way to kind of connect their experience to other folks, then yeah, you're well on your way.
I absolutely think this is relevant. I mean, I think we've used a term for a while now where people are trying to design product that is useful and sticky and important to their end users. And you'll hear terms like, oh, we could gamify that or something. And I think people's perceptions are, oh, we could give them a badge or something. But what's really going on is that the gaming industry, delved into human psychology in order to really understand that end user, instead of like, it's not about toys and being fun, it is about human psychology. So if we think about great product design, and as you were talking, I was like, oh, when I think about the products that I like to engage with, they do those things for me, because it's not actually about just a transaction that these companies want to make. They're actually deeply thinking about me as a human being, which is what you were saying, right? Like at the other end of whatever your product you're building is a human. They are driven by these things: intrinsic motivation, feeling like they're part of a community, being admired for something they've achieved. So I can absolutely confirm that those are those great products. Like I was just thinking, I'm building the back end to a Shopify website, and it's really complicated. There's like shipping. I have to integrate with subscriptions. But I signed onto it as a novice, thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through all of this? And they had like a progress bar every step, and it just helped me go, I'm getting there. And then I got to the last one, and the feeling I had inside, it was like 11 p.m. at night, and the deep sense of self-satisfaction. It wasn't about Shopify. It was about me and how I felt about what I had achieved. So that was, as you were talking, I was like, yes, great products are designed like that. You have some really interesting other theories, and actually I think you should write a book if you haven't already. But there's, I've looked into things like cognitive biases that you've mentioned, arbitrary nature of preference, choice blindness, and internal reflection. Can you explain some of these theories about how you evaluate and how you think human beings think as they're approaching games and life in general, actually?
Very, very kind of you. I appreciate the kind words. So some of the topics you mentioned, I think were my attempt really to, again, like do that direct application of findings from psychology to questions of interest in game design. I think you mentioned cognitive biases, and so that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of psychologists who spent their entire careers looking at all the ways in which essentially we're not as good at thinking as we think we are. Our brain is a pattern matcher, and when presented with scenarios and environments and constructs, right, it often takes the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance is not always the correct path. There are a variety of just kind of systematic errors or flaws in human decision making, right, or human processing or human cognition that if you're aware of them, right, you can design products that help to ameliorate or improve them, or reduce their impact, and can kind of produce more productive or kind of more effective outcomes for your users. And so one example might be, there's a few different kind of ways of kind of, I guess, think about. So there's a theory called prospect theory, which is, I guess, Kahneman and Tversky, who are famous psychologists, kind of, and they did a bunch of the pioneering work in this space. It's this notion that, a gain of, so a loss of equivalent magnitude is twice as impactful as a gain of equivalent magnitude, right? So losing $50 is twice as harmful as the positive experience of gaining $50, right? So we tend to, again, looking at like values of equal magnitude but opposite direction, we take the losses harder. And so, okay, like that's just, that is a fundamental, that is something that is, endemic to the human experience. If you have, and I guess to turn that into like kind of like a specific instantiation in product development, given the choice between introducing a feature and taking it away or never introducing it at all, you might actually, be better served by never introducing it at all, right? If there is a significant chance you're going to take it away because people respond poorly to loss. So, even if you're, again, supplementing, the loss of that feature with the addition of another feature that provides equivalent, in a vacuum value to the user, taking away things is often a negative experience of the user. You have expectations that are built up and kind of people respond poorly when those expectations are violated and when they lose something they previously had access to. And so, we think about that in game design all the time, right? So the cost of implementing a feature is not just the cost of implementing the feature, right? It's the potential kind of long-term impact of improving the feature. There's the notion of, I'm just trying to think about like ones that might be relevant. There's the notion of the endowment effect, where if you tend to overvalue things you own. So, if you see a vase on the shelf and you're like, it costs $10 to buy, you buy it for $10, and someone asks you to buy it from you, you're not going to sell it to them for $10. You're going to sell it to them for $12. As soon as we own something, we tend to ascribe a higher value to it. Okay. So like that's interesting in the context of games anyway, for, economic system design, right? Where people are willing to kind of, wager or use some currency to acquire, maybe an in-game item or whatnot. But as soon as they acquire it, it's going to cost a lot more for them to sell it. And so if you're trying to like foster trading between players in a game, for example, right, like that's something you need to keep in mind, right? And account for. It's like, how do you account for like this ownership premium that exists? And so more broadly speaking, just trying to understand what biases might be present, right, in terms of, any user action that, any user interaction that your customers or your users are having with your product, will help inform your design, right? And you can try to understand, why certain behaviors that may seem puzzling are occurring. Why people stop using your product, or why they continue using the product, or how much they value using your product. Just understanding kind of like the range of ways in which, human thinking is not necessarily rational or always kind of like empirically driven, but is often just, we take a bunch of shortcuts in our day because we don't have the time or the energy or, the cognitive capacity, right, to kind of effectively evaluate every decision we make. And so if you understand what shortcuts your users are taking and, hopefully why they're taking them, then you can get much smarter about, addressing the issues that arise and also designing a product that meets the needs of your users, right? So if you just kind of design in a vacuum for, a quote unquote, a completely rational user, that may be great, but you also may end up kind of missing the mark entirely because people are responding in ways that, are kind of guided by these biases that influence decision making that are unconscious and hard to overcome.
As you're talking about this, I was thinking about when features are they're being switched off, and you can see it happening in the platform. And these great companies with great products, they signpost it. That they'll say, again, I'm actually going to bring it back to Shopify because it's my most recent one. But they were saying, we're going to have a one-page checkout, and that's going to happen on the 5th of October. You can do it now or on the 5th of October. And I'm looking at it as a new user for Shopify going, why wouldn't I do a one-page checkout? That's less barriers for my customer. I immediately accepted it. But then I realized, no, there'll be other people who have been using this platform for 5 years or so. And they're like, I don't want to move to that. But they're being given notification. I also take it back to, there's a lot of companies that are maybe 10-year-old companies, and they have a very old platform. It's a 10-year-old platform. They actually have to rebuild the same platform, but of course they're not going to design it the same. But they also have the same problem of, will our users like it? And that's what you're really talking about. It's like, it's not rational, because a lot of the time we sit there and go, but it's going to be better. It's more that irrational, you're taking away something that you gave to me. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And I think kind of just listening to you talk, just another one that sprung to mind that I think a lot of, another bias that is often present that comes to mind, right, is this notion of kind of a bias towards the default. And so you think about companies that offer options, and software design has kind of incorporated this. It is a widespread practice now, but, product designers and folks kind of designing products that sometimes miss it, is that we do have a tendency to choose the default option. And so if you give people the choice between, say, implementation A, B, or C, and implementation A is checked, people will often just select implementation A because that is the default option. You might make a change to implementation B that makes it better, but no one uses it because they keep selecting the default option, right? And so it's not because implementation B was worse or it's not working as intended. It's because another bias, like something is counteracting like people's impulse to even explore or try implementation B. And so just another kind of, quick example of factors that could be influencing, your design in ways that are maybe counterintuitive or, less obvious, right? It can actually have detrimental impacts on, the success of your product, the success of your company, due to things that are mundane and unrelated to the quality of the feature or the product or the design itself.
I wanted to mostly talk to you about your understanding of users and how to get product market fit, which is what we're talking about today, really. It's like, if you want your product to make sense to your users, how do you actually deeply understand them as a human being? That was primarily what our conversation today. But we have another segment of the show about international expansion. And I was like, Actually, I think, like, even though you're not been in charge of taking these businesses offshore, you have been involved in this company that is global. I don't even know how many countries that Valve and Steam would be in. I'd be like 196 or something crazy like that. But
I think it's most of them, yeah.
Yeah, it's like all of them with internet. Can you talk to us about your experience in game design in terms of going to these other countries, understanding that not every human in every country is going to feel and act the same, that there's a vast difference in our cultures. Is there any examples that you can share with me about learning about that?
It's a really interesting question, because I think it touches upon this broader notion of human behavior, where that it is very difficult for us to put ourselves in other people's shoes, right? We attempt to, and we can be empathetic, right? And we can rationally kind of consider options, but we have this sense of ourselves, right? A representation of ourselves and the way we think about things. And we kind of apply that, right, to our interactions with other people, right? And product designers apply this to their customers, right? And to their customers in different countries. And so it can be very difficult to identify how, different, cultures or beliefs or expectations that, customer bases in different countries will have, and then, consequently how that will impact, reception of your product, right? So designing a product for an American audience versus a European audience versus an Asian audience. And those are broad, kind of descriptors as well, right? We would often try and think about, okay, what are the cultural assumptions we are making? Valve has a bunch of folks from kind of all around the world, right? So it was amazing to have, to get different perspectives. But for sure, there was a bias towards, Americans, right? Americans have certain expectations about the way games are made. And, when we started making games and that were hopefully designed to appeal to a worldwide audience, you had to start and we'd gather data about, what are the, expectations about iconography, right? Or metaphors that were used in dialogue, or expectations about behavior, right? That were kind of, I guess, acceptable or not to Americans, right? And were not acceptable to other cultures, right? Or were expected or not of Americans, or not to other cultures. And so nothing beats obviously direct exposure, right, to the environment and speaking with folks, right, who kind of share their experiences and help inform. The way we would kind of attack this problem is again, going back to that notion of trying to devise hypotheses, right? And then, running experiments to gather data is, you might have notions about, just to pick a silly example in games, right? Like the effectiveness of, certain iconography to represent, this is an exit. You're playing a game and you're looking for the exit to a level. and we have certain assumptions about how that might look like in America that might differ from, those of Japan, right? Or India. You could run experiments, right, where you looked at, how quickly people could navigate through levels, right, in America and in India and in Japan, and see, right, and use kind of data to kind of inform your decision making about what's going on. And so, sometimes we would design experiments because we would notice a problem, or sometimes we would have data that would suggest there was a problem, but then we had to go, design an experiment to go fix it. I guess the broader point is that in the abstract, right, trying to design without direct contact, with folks from another country, with exposure to other cultures, right, and without understanding kind of at a core level, like what expectations people have, again, you can run into issues where something that you took for granted, right, that makes sense for folks from one country, right, does not transfer at all. So we would oftentimes explicitly try and design experiments and gather information from users, from players all around the world, right, and look for differences in behavior, and then use that to inform theory about why those differences existed. And then, again, you do this enough, right? And, this is a large ask for a company, but if you're a mature company, you can do this, the cycle of iteration over and over in experimentation, and eventually you should be able to get to the point where, you can make more informed decisions and make fewer mistakes about dealing with kind of product market fit in different cultures and in different countries.
Basically, experimenting, again, is another one. Making sure you're talking to them, making sure you're engaging with them, and making sure you're aware of your own unconscious bias as to what you're assuming about your customers and end users and other markets. You and I connected through a platform, the fractional community, because that spun up quite a lot. And I saw I saw you pop up to say that you're actually now contracting. What are you doing these days?
I spent 15 years at Valve, had an amazing, wonderful time there. And so I have a bunch of experience working, at a game company. And I know what that's like. I am kind of forcing my professional curiosity and trying to see if the consulting advising route is the right direction. I have a bunch of, research ideas that I would like to perform and carry out, and I'm not quite sure of the most effective professional framework to do them yet, whether it's through consulting or going back to a company or doing a startup or whatnot. I mentioned earlier that psychology does kind of a pretty poor job of demonstrating its utility and domain, and so I hope to kind of at least demonstrate some of that capability in games, and I'd like to continue doing so in games, but then also kind of more broadly. I think there are just a bunch of interesting research to be done in applied context, right? Like most of psychology, at least is basic research, right, done for theory and to generate knowledge and add to the world. But the notion of just applying that knowledge in whether it's gaming or outside of gaming, and like people use terms like user research, HCI is about a term that gets thrown around. I think there are just so many fascinating problems, and so I guess at the moment I am actively engaged, with a few folks, kind of in a few domains, working on them, and hope to continue doing so. And then if I can carve out time on my own to kind of answer some of the research questions that I think would be additive to the world. I hope in some respects, things like reducing online toxicity. I spent some time doing non-invasive brain-computer interface research, so like measuring physiological signals, heart rate, EEG, facial expressions, things like that. I think there's a really interesting opportunity to take some of that work and think about designing, environments or interfaces or technology or games that can adapt in real time to information the body is providing. So like an exemplar of that might be if you could detect the precursors to a panic attack. Somehow, hey, we think a panic attack is likely in the next, few minutes. How would you want your environment to respond? Maybe the environment could respond, you could have speaker playing calming music. Your phone could give you breathing cues. Maybe the lights in your house dim. It's more just the general notion of, how would you want your environment to respond, right? To help, kind of ameliorate or treat the symptoms of a panic attack, if we could, right? And you could detect a panic attack through, your phone, or maybe the microphone, maybe you have a sensor you're wearing. That broad space of kind of like adaptive interfaces that are responsive to physiological signals, like, so, helping with anxiety, maybe helping with depression, maybe helping with like concentration or flow or focus, just broadening that kind of space of, industries and domains where, there's a wealth of information the body is providing, that we provide that is not currently being measured. And if it was, what are the interesting things you could do in that environment to kind of improve, performance or well-being, or productivity in some fashion. I just think it's a very fertile ground to experiment in. I would love to see progress made in that space. And so definitely spend some time. I am spending some time working on that. And yeah, very curious as to what the future holds.
And the timing's right with all the wearable tech, your connected devices, Web3, that all these promises about a much more immersive world. Fascinating. Hey, this has been a really incredible discussion. I really thank you for your time and your insights and knowledge into this world of human psychology and what it should and could mean to our products and the products we design for real humans at the other side of it. So thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shona. Yeah, it was a pleasure talking. I love talking about this stuff. And I loved your questions. So thank you very much for the invitation and for bringing me on. And I had a great conversation.
I'm Hussein Al-Bedri, producer of These Three Things. This part of the podcast is called The Three Learned Things. Shona and I wanted to briefly reflect on the three key insights we got from today's episode, which is brought to you in association with Callahan Innovations' Upskill products. These products are designed to help startups uncover and acquire the skills they need to succeed.
Mike was fantastic. There was a whole bunch of learning for me. What did you take away from it?
There was so much in there. I mean, he is clearly a master of his craft, and the insight that he brought from psychology and gaming into product design was really outstanding. The first thing that I learned was around the scientific method of doing your product design. He talked about gathering data and creating your hypothesis and experimenting and doing that data gathering and iteration. He said, make sure you're gathering data from people who are not you. And I think that's really important because a lot of product teams will try to fulfill that cycle of research themselves. And it is useful to have someone who's not wedded to an idea come and do the testing, because you're naturally going to have biases yourself towards what you think you want to hear from your customers.
That was a big thing that I picked up on as well, was that unconscious bias. We hear about it, we apply it to hiring people or all of our decisions, right? It all comes from our formed experiences in life. And that's a massive danger that he was pointing out. And I think as founders and product managers and product owners of our business, we just have to kind of go, just because you believe it's true doesn't make it so, and that we have to understand we carry unconscious bias. And I think it then leads back into be mindful of that and making sure that you are getting the data from elsewhere. So yeah, I think very much aligned on that. What else for you? What was the last one?
The last one is really around how we talked about intrinsic motivation, because, extrinsic motivation is quite obvious, but intrinsic motivation that you can embed into your product so that you enable users to feel a sense of fulfillment when they're using your product. So the whole, how do you provide agency to your end user so they feel like they're in control? How do you give them a sense of scope progression so that they are progressing along some sort of axis? And social connectedness, how do you give them a sense of connection to other people? Or he's talked about, we all like to look good to other people and get credit for it. So how do we build those shared experiences with people?
And I think that's quite relevant as we move into generative AI, isn't it? I think a lot of us are going, brilliant. We're going to build products where the product will do everything for our end user. And I think we need to be quite wary of that. We're thinking about the end user, thinking about what motivates us as human beings. And he's saying intrinsic value. They want to feel that they're in control of their own destiny and they have autonomy and agency, because that's where they get their admiration. So I think there's going to be a fine balance in the future of balancing product design with generative AI and making sure that the end user feels in control. Can you do me a favor? If you like this episode, can you hit the subscribe button? It really makes a huge difference to us, and it means that we can continue to evolve, grow, and bring more insights from a larger variety of guests. Thank you for listening to These Three Things. Our podcast is fueled by our passion and admiration for startups and the courageous people who create them. A huge thanks to our wonderful listeners and guests, my producer Hussein Al-Badri, our sound and visual crew, Elisa Grishkova and Carl Butler, and our sponsor, Callahan Innovation, who are just as committed and passionate about the ecosystem as we are. Tune in next week for another episode of These Three Things.